Tears of the Kingdom has just released, or, well, I guess by now it's probably been out for a couple months, several months, I don't know, but it wasn't that long ago. And while every other person and their dog has been going on about this being the long-awaited sequel to one of the most popular and genre-defining games in modern history, I looked at it and thought, maybe I should give Breath of the Wild a try. Hello, my name is Thorbin, and I am what you might call a casual gamer, and I just now decided I was going to play Breath of the Wild for the first time. Of course, I'm on the YouTubes, and thus it's entirely impossible to not have been exposed to the game in some capacity since its release 6 years ago, so I can't go into the game totally blind. But Breath of the Wild, I've heard, is quite massive, and all I really know about it is that it's an open world, there's these things called shrines, and I'm supposed to take down divine beasts or whatever. So that's what I decided to do. I would play the game till I beat the Divine Beast and Ganon, as well as whatever side quests I felt like doing along the way, and, well, I did it, and I have some thoughts. Today we're going to go through the good and the bad of Breath of the Wild from the point of view of some random guy on the internet who hasn't played it until just now. Let's start with the good, so that way I don't get torched on the internet after the first minute of the video. I'll be separating the good and the bad into 3 sections that we'll discuss: the world, the combat, and gameplay and mechanics, or I guess kind of the miscellaneous category. You might feel like mentioning there's a story in this game, but we're not going to focus on that, and we're just going to focus on the actual game side of things. I also didn't think I'd even be making this video until I had defeated 3 of the Divine Beasts, so I don't have some of the footage that I would want for some of the things I'll be talking about, so it'll just kind of be background stuff as we discuss Breath of the Wild, and I'll pull in some things here and there that I do have. With that out of the way, let's start with the world. It's pretty big. Alright, we'll discuss it more. The first and most important thing about the world in Breath of the Wild is how it guides you from one place to another. Open worlds can suffer from leaving the player with no idea as to what to do, or give them nothing to do in the first place. Breath of the Wild remedies this with shrines and towers that glow a rather conspicuous orange. While you're in the tutorial area, it teaches you what shrines are by requiring you to conquer 3 of them before you can escape the starting area. And now that you know glowing orange means something good, your eye will always be drawn to these things as you explore. You may choose to ignore them if the pinging sound from the radar isn't driving you crazy, or you may choose to conquer each one of them that you find for those spirit orbs. This is a fantastic way to handle open worlds because it never feels like the game is telling you to do anything. You're free to roam around, doing anything you want, but the game unobtrusively kind of prompts you to engage with the available content by offering the reward of spirit orbs, as well as access to a wider teleportation network. There is no number of shrines you must defeat before you can access any part of the game. It's all purely in the gamer's hands, which is how an open world should be. Open worlds, though, do need to give players plenty of things to do, but they also need to do it in a way so that players feel like they're the ones making the decisions. So you place giant glowing towers directly in the view of gamers because you know we can't help but check out large glowing things. But you didn't tell us that we had to go to that tower, you just put it there, glowing, menacingly, making us think that we're in control. So they made the game in a way that made people want to play the game that they wanted people to play it, which is a great way to design it. You don't want it to be too conspicuous that you're guiding people where you want them to go, but you do design it so that way they naturally want to do the things that you want them to do. So that was a great design choice. Breath of the Wild does this splendidly and pushes the player to explore the world further, which brings me to my second point about the world. It's seemingly endless. When I first got onto the game and discovered that I could reveal more of the map by accessing the towers, I made it a goal of mine to find all of the towers and fill out my map. Having it made things much easier, so I naturally wanted to fill out the map so I can navigate the landscape with that ease. But then there was tower after tower after tower. They were absolutely everywhere, and there were several times I thought I had revealed the entire map, only to realize there was even more because there was some glowing orange tower way off in the distance over the mountains. And that's another thing about the towers. Because they were so tall, they often made it possible for you to see another tower somewhere in the distance after claiming one of them. So once you got one tower, it was pretty easy a lot of the time to see the next one, which often prompted me to go to that next tower because I wanted my map to be filled and I wanted to know what else was out there. I would describe the world overall as deep enough for you to get lost in, but shallow enough for you to never be lost. If you just want to hit the major points of the game, then you can, and it won't be all that frustrating to find what you need. On the other hand, there are so many little side things for you to do and explore that you can spend hours upon hours in one small area. I must admit though, there were times that things felt pretty similar to each other, but not often enough, which is pretty impressive for an open world this big. Part of that variety comes with different biomes you can explore. There are mountains, volcanoes, deserts, forests, and plains, and maybe some other smaller biomes. You can tell me if there are. I want to say there was a tundra, but there wasn't really. It was mostly just tall mountains that get cold. Speaking of the cold though, the environmental factors make things more interesting sometimes, but also frustrating at others. I'm placing this in the good category though because I think it was handled well. There are plenty of potions and foods that can make you resistant to the cold and heat, or fire, whatever with the volcano one, and you're often given some of the ingredients for these things in the surrounding areas. So if you're about to go into the cold biome, you'll often be able to find warm ingredients, I guess, in the surrounding areas. There are also outfits that make the whole thing much easier by basically making you immune, but I never found any of these weather-resistant ones until after I had first braved the elements, which I guess is kind of a good thing because it makes you problem solve a bit before giving you the easy way out. But that's enough about the world. Let's get into the combat, one of my favorite parts of any game. I love combat. And full transparency, one of the main reasons I never played this game until just now is because weapons have durability. The idea of my weapons breaking turned me off from the game entirely. That, and I thought that a massive open world sounded boring at the time because Breath of the Wild was pretty fresh or pretty new in the whole open world, I guess, genre. So at the time, it really did not seem very interesting. But now it's basically ubiquitous, so it doesn't feel as weird now. Suffice it to say, any game that has durability as a mechanic is a big red flag to me, since it feels to me like the game has artificially created a reason for me to spend more time in the game, since I'd have to just keep on grinding to get my gear back. Breath of the Wild, however, doesn't do that. In fact, I'll applaud how it uses durability here, though we'll return to this during the bad section of the video. I approached combat much differently in Breath of the Wild than I normally would in any other game. When durability is not a factor, all you ever do is select your best weapon for any given situation and stick to it. In some games, you're reduced to only using a single weapon because it's just that good. I don't entirely mind that too much in some cases, but then Breath of the Wild came along and maybe used a few more brain cells than I normally do, and by Jones, this is actually rather enjoyable. The fact that my weapons can break at any time forced me to consider which one I wanted to use for any given situation. Upon approach, I would have to weigh the pros and cons of using a better or worse weapon. I could either risk death by using an inferior weapon that would make the fight much harder, or else use a good weapon and easily defeat the enemy, but at the risk of my good weapon breaking. Having to juggle which weapons I used made combat much more interesting, because it was about a lot more than just beating up the enemy. Another factor to this is the weapons I could see monsters using. Sometimes I would see a good weapon that they were using, so I would draw my best weapon to steal it from them. On the other hand, sometimes strong enemies would have no weapon at all, so I'd want to use my sticks and clubs on them, only to have the battle drag on forever because the monster had so much health. And I must applaud the game for providing so many weapons along the journey that I rarely had an empty slot. It's almost impossible to not come across some sort of weapon, so there isn't really that grinding factor that I mentioned earlier because there's so many weapons that are available to you. But there was more to combat than just deciding whether to use a stronger or weaker weapon. There was also basically 3 weapon types. There were two-handed or heavy weapons, there's one-handed weapons, and then there's spears. There are also wands and bows, but what real gamer uses those anyways? No, we're getting up close and personal. The great thing about these 3 types of weapons is that they are all functionally different. The heavy weapons are slow but tend to deal more damage, and most importantly, they can be used to juggle enemies by knocking them off their feet. Even the weakest two-handed club can be useful for smacking even some of the strongest enemies off a cliff. Not to mention you can charge them up and spin around until your stamina is drained entirely, allowing you to cheese things like Hinox. For this reason alone, heavy weapons are some of the best in the game, because you can kill even the strongest enemies if they're next to a cliff with a wooden club. but they're still slow and leave you vulnerable to attack. That brings us to the one-handed weapons. This is the only weapon type that lets you hold out your shield, which, believe it or not, can be incredibly helpful, especially when you're surrounded by enemies or facing down faraway archers. There's also a parrying system with the shield, but I always forgot how to use it, so I never ended up really ever using it. Maybe that would have been helpful, but it never really happened. I typically then switched to one-handed weapons when I needed to make sure I landed the first blow against an enemy. Faster foes made it hard to hit them sometimes with heavy weapons, so using these one-handed swords allowed me to contend with faster enemies. Then there's spears, which may be my favorite weapon type despite them receiving what I think is the least love. Spears leave you vulnerable just like heavy weapons do, but they don't suffer from the slow speed, and they have the greatest reach out of any of the three weapon types. Spears can be used to deal with some of the faster enemies before they could even get close to you, since you could just stab them a bunch before they even knew what hit them. The lizard creatures in particular were best dealt with using a spear, since they can move pretty quick and be hard to hit. For the same reason, I hated enemies with spears the most. The extra reach it gave them made them a real pain to deal with, especially when fighting groups of enemies with different weapon types. Whenever I was in a crowd, the first enemy I would target were the spearmen, so I could wipe out the ones with the greatest reach. Though you didn't always want to target an enemy in the first place. One area where Breath of the Wild shines is that there are some enemies you actually fear. The primary two enemies that fall into this category, of course, are the Lynel and the Guardians. The Hinoc and Stone Talus could also fit in this category, but I didn't find myself ever particularly fearful to engage with them. Hinocs were easy to spot from a distance, approach, and spam some spinning heavy weapon until they were already on the brink of death. Stone Talus, on the other hand, I don't have any particular fear of because I only ever encountered two of them. The first I beat maybe an hour or two into the game, and by the time I encountered the second, I had forgotten how to beat them altogether and decided to just ignore it. Lynel and the Guardians are not this way though. Lynel could be avoided easily enough, but they have much longer range of detection than Hinoc, and they're much faster and more aggressive. You could avoid a fight if you really wanted to, but because they could see you much easier, whenever I spotted one in my path, I would immediately pump the brakes and go the other way. Guardians, on the other hand, I would sometimes race directly into their line of fire, but only when I was riding a good horse. It wasn't too terribly difficult to dodge their lasers, but it definitely got the heart rate up whenever they looked at you. Moving at an angle or doing a little serpentine was often all you needed to do to avoid them, but you always knew that one shot was all that it would take to kill you, so it still made you a little nervous. This also made it really satisfying when I decided to dismount my horse and attack the Lynel or the Guardians. The Lynel were much more interesting to fight since you could actually beat them with the sticks and stones you pick up on your adventure. While Guardians, on the other hand, I was never brave enough to take on until I had some of the Guardian arrows, at which point I would walk up to their face as they targeted me and one-shot them with the bow that shot 3 arrows for the cost of 1. So Guardians are either unstoppable monsters or total pushovers, while Lynel are another story altogether. They are never particularly easy. Once you've gotten their pattern down, you can beat them simply enough, but they had such a large pool of health that it became a game of how long can you be perfect, since it often only took 1 or 2 hits for them to kill you. Overall, I'm a big fan of the Lynel, and fighting them was really what made me feel the most powerful. I should also mention the biome or elemental weapons. There's thunder, fire, and ice weapons around the world, and they're all pretty much better than anything else that's not an elemental weapon. Ice froze enemies, allowing you to get a free hit in. Thunder stunned enemies, allowing you to get a bunch of free hits in. And fire, well, fire, I felt was useful more as a tool than a weapon. They were still good as a weapon, but using them to break crates and get cooked food straight away, keeping you warm in cold environments, or lighting different torch or candle things, whatever. That's basically what they were best for, I felt. I think I should also mention that these elemental weapons always felt as though they had greater durability than any of the other weapons I used. I had a Thunder Spear for probably over half of the time I played the game, which is incredible. It just refused to break, and I loved it for that. I even had it when I went to fight Ganon. I mean, seriously, I did have this Thunder Spear for probably over half of the game. This one Thunder Spear, and it didn't even have a durability up increase or anything like that. And because of this, and I would have done it anyways, but also because of this, I always had a thunder weapon on me, so I could stun enemies when I needed to and get in some free hits. Overall, thunder was definitely the best elemental type in my opinion. There's even a Colosseum that I didn't bother with until after recording some extra footage after taking down Ganon, and I discovered that it's lined with enemies carrying elemental weapons. If I had known about this sooner, I would definitely have farmed it after every single blood moon. Now let's finally talk about the good parts of the gameplay mechanics. Some of this I've actually already covered while talking about other things, so I'll recap some of them here as we discuss some of the things I missed. One of those things is Korok seeds. Getting these seeds is rather annoying, frankly, and I never found myself particularly interested in collecting them, but they are necessary if you want to increase how much stuff you can hold. This is another way the game pushes you to engage with more of the content, and it's not even that bad since getting Korok seeds is at most a 1-minute detour to shoot a few arrows or place a block in the right spot, but I want to focus primarily on their purpose for existing, to expand your inventory. When I do occasionally play a game with durability, I end up often only using the weak weapons because I'm afraid of the strong ones breaking. But because I couldn't just stockpile an infinite number of wooden clubs, I was pushed further into the corner, occasionally forcing me to use stronger weapons so I didn't break every single wooden club I had on a single enemy. I usually hate when a game limits my inventory as much as Breath of the Wild does, since you can really feel just how few weapons you can hold, but because of this, I had to seriously weigh the pros and cons of every weapon, and as mentioned, it added another factor to how I engaged enemies. There were even times that I would drop a stronger weapon for the sake of picking up a spear or heavy weapon, since it was better to have weapon variety than just the ones with the highest numbers. So I guess the good part of Korok seeds is not using them because the limited inventory space was actually kind of good in some cases, though it was also definitely great to have more inventory when I was able to, but that's mostly what I wanted to mention. Then there's also how progression in the game works. At first, you're given a few specific tasks and places to go, but afterwards, you're given pretty free reign. Granted, you can do whatever you want whenever you want, but the game does guide you to a few places at the start to familiarize you with what you can do. And after that, progression is basically summed up in one sentence: explore until something happens. This would usually be a negative for a game since I want some sort of direction instead of wandering aimlessly. All I knew was that there were glowing orange towers, and I wanted to get all of them so I'd have a map to work with. From this exploration, however, I stumbled upon the Zora domain, and ended up conquering my first divine beast. Not because I was told to go there, or because the game showed me where it was, but because I stumbled upon some random Zora guy who prompted me to follow a certain path. Once I had done that, it gave me a better understanding as to how the other divine beasts probably worked, and I found it pretty easy to go from there and take down each beast after that. There's also shrines which the game prompts you to find, but in a bit more obtrusive of a way. Of course, I'm talking about the Shrine Finder radar thingy. A lot of people, from what I can tell, hate this thing, but I actually kinda like it. Whenever it went off, I thought, oh, there's a shrine nearby. Maybe I should find it. When normally I would have raced right past it, none the wiser. I do think that its range is a bit too wide, but overall I thought it was helpful for telling me when a shrine was near so I can make a decision as to whether to search for it or not. And for some of the shrines that are literally hidden inside of mountains, I would never in a million years have found them without its guidance. So despite some people's hatred for it and the fact that it's one of the most obtrusive parts of the game, I did like it since it pushed me to engage with more of the game's content than I would have without it. But that's enough about the praise. Time to get to the stuff that might get me in trouble with the internet. It's time to talk about the bad things in Breath of the Wild. Horses. Every single open world game can be graded solely on how well its horses are handled, and Breath of the Wild makes it incredibly difficult to ride a horse anywhere other than the prescribed path. The number of times I've come across a twig or a pebble and my horse stopped as though it ran into a brick wall is staggering. Breath of the Wild, 2 out of 10, bad horse control. But seriously though, I wanted to make an entire section of this video just about how awful it is to ride horses in this game because it stuck out like a sore thumb. Traversing Breath of the Wild's world without a horse takes absolutely forever. It's almost unplayable. Even having a large shrine network to teleport between doesn't suffice a lot of the time, and the only way to get around without constantly stopping and starting or sprinting is with a horse. Now, they made it so horses will follow the road automatically, so that way you can take your hands off the remote and just look at the scenery. Guess I get the idea behind it, but I find this kind of stupid. I'm not playing the game to look at it, but to play it, and I'm riding a horse so I can get somewhere. Granted, this mechanic never really was a problem, and it can be pretty easy to break your steed out of the autopilot, but once you do, you're in for a ride. Slight inclines and declines are usually fine, but every here and there your horse will skid along as if it forgot how to walk. Small stones and bushes that you would normally walk straight through without a problem are often too big of an obstacle for your horse to simply walk over. There were many times when I would pull the joystick back to get the horse to stop on purpose, but it wouldn't after several tries. Maybe that's a controller thing, but it happened while using several different controllers, so I blame the game. There are also plenty of times I'd mount the horse and try to turn it around, but it would just walk straight into a wall instead, ignoring my controls altogether. Similarly, there were many times I would try to swerve ever so slightly to the left, but the horse would refuse to turn at all. Now, there is that whole taming thing and you gotta kind of pat it, but it's usually pretty obvious when you need to do that, and I never had a problem with that factor. This was just a control thing. It wasn't the horse being disobedient, unless there's some sort of disobedience you can't control, and it will just every here and there decide not to turn when you're telling it to turn, and you can't do anything about it, which would suck. That's just a bad mechanic if that's actually how it works. Now, you may think horses did not need to be discussed this much. After all, there are other things about the game that I think aren't great, that more people would point to when talking about the game's flaws, but I sort of meant it when I said a game can be graded on how well an open world treats their horses. And there's one reason for that, and one reason only. I like horses. That's it. I really like them, and I want to feel good riding them, dang it. Now on to the stuff more people probably care about, and from here on we'll follow a similar format as the good stuff about the game. So let's talk about the world again. I mentioned that it's big enough to get lost in, while also shallow enough to never get lost. While this is true, and I stand by that, there are also many times when the world felt a little too big. Don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily want them to shrink the size of the world, but at the same time, there are several locations where you can't bring a horse and you're stuck walking on foot. I put a lot of spirit orbs into stamina vessels instead of hearts because it was annoying only being able to run for a couple of seconds at a time as I tried to make my way to some village or shrine. Then there's also climbing, and I honestly think that I would have had a much worse time with the game if I hadn't invested so heavily into stamina vessels. Now, I suppose there are stamina restoring foods I could have made, but cooking wasn't one thing I was interested in doing at all. This is a bit of a side note, but I hated cooking. You can only cook one dish at a time. It doesn't say the last slot you were on, so if your food item just so happens to be one of the last ones in your inventory, then you have to flip all the way over back there every single time you want to cook it. And then when you do cook it, you need to skip some stupid cutscene they added for whatever reason, and you're rapidly pressing the A button because you don't care about the details, you just wanted food. Now, back to the climbing, which I'm sure anyone who's played this game before knows where I'm going with this. Rain and climbing do not mix. Now, you may argue this adds to the realism of the world, but trying to climb in the rain is simply not something you're ever going to do. The distance it sets you back when you slip is just about equal to the distance you climbed to get there in the first place. So doing so is literally doing nothing but burning stamina. I would even make it halfway up some really big rock or a cliff edge when rain would suddenly come, and instead of resetting the climb, because climbing takes forever, I just put down the controller and did other things as I waited for the rain to stop. If you want to make me slip, make it gradual, so that way progress can at least be made with some determination. Eating stamina food or potions literally means nothing when climbing in the rain because you just can't make progress. Speaking of the weather, I have a love-hate relationship with lightning and thunderstorms, but I'm putting it in the bad category because overall I wasn't a fan. First, the positive of it is that it gives you a reason to always have a wooden weapon, shield, and bow on hand, so that way you are actually capable of fighting enemies during these storms. But that's also the bad part of it. Wooden clubs, shields, and bows are pathetically weak, and rightfully so. but a poorly timed thunderstorm sometimes meant I'd have to put away all of my weapons and wait out the storm, since the only path forward has enemies far too strong to fight with wooden sticks. This is also a minor thing, but having to unequip a metal shield, bow, and sword was a little obnoxious. Now, these thunderstorms were pretty cool, actually, just to look at and added to the atmosphere, but overall, they, like the rain, often felt like an arbitrary hindrance to progress. Now let's talk about the negatives to the combat, and first up is durability. I know I praised this before, but now it's time to get into the negatives in it because things can be both good and bad at the same time, and durability will always fall into this trap. The main thing about durability is that there are some weapons I really liked, and not just because their numbers were necessarily high. I just thought they were cool or functioned in a way that I particularly liked. I hated when these ones broke, and I wish there was some way to hold on to them longer. You would think durability would create a mood of not caring when they break because you know it's going to happen, but I loved some of the weapons I got and I hated to see them go, which I guess is more of a personal gripe, and maybe a lot of these negatives are going to be kind of just personal things where it's I really wanted this or really wish this had been a thing as opposed to a problem with the game itself. And for durability, I'm not even sure if adding a feature that let you repair weapons would even be a good idea. But could I at least get a little bar or something that indicates how damaged my weapons are so I could decide whether I wanted to use them or not? I know there comes a point where it says, hey, it's damaged, at which point it means 1 or 2 more attacks will break it, which is fine, but I would love something that would let me anticipate its breaking a lot sooner than that. And I'd also love for there to be a universal treasure chest or storage system. Like, place one at each of the stables or villages and allow me to dump weapons in there. I honestly would have placed some of my favorites in there just so they didn't break. In particular, a great flame blade I found in a treasure chest. I only ever found one of this weapon and it made me sad. That is, until I discovered the Colosseum I mentioned after beating the game, which made me a little upset, but I guess that's my fault for not finding that earlier. But maybe that universal storage feature would also remove the need for Koroks in the first place, but who knows. I just wish there was a way I could have held on to some of the weapons I had. Now you may have noticed that at this point I haven't really talked about bosses yet, and that's because they go into the bad section. Now I did find the desert one to be kind of enjoyable, what with its super speed, and actually made the boss a little more difficult, but it was also the last one I fought, so I had all kinds of powers that made him more of a pushover than he would have been if he had been the first boss I had fought. But the thing is, 2 of the bosses can be fought at any point in progression with no problem at all, and that's the water and air ones. Literally, all you have to do to defeat these bosses is spam arrows, and you'll take them down in no time at all. Especially the water one, where you're even required to gather a certain number of arrows that it's vulnerable to in order to fight it. At least the fire and desert or lightning ones reached a second phase where you can't just spam arrows and you would have to use a few more brain cells to figure out how to beat them. And trust me when I say I used far too many brain cells than I should have needed to use. But once you figure out the one thing you gotta do, they become pretty easy once again. There were times where you run into a run-of-the-mill mob on the ground that was a greater threat than these bosses. Heck, the Lynel and Guardians I talked about before are much more terrifying than these ever were. I suppose Zelda has never had the hardest bosses in the world. I've only ever played Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, so maybe the other games do something different, but those 2 basically came down to just use the weapon or tool you literally got 2 minutes ago in the same temple. Though even so, there was something about several of those bosses that was still interesting to me. Not sure what it was, but it was definitely missing from Breath of the Wild. The thing is too, arrows aren't even that OP against anything else unless you use Guardian arrows on Guardians. Sure, with a strong enough bow, and by that I mean literally any of the 1 million Knight's bows you'll find in the world, you can one-shot most of the weak monsters, and if you get headshots, you can stun most, if not all, of the strong ones and deal good damage, but overall, I found myself not really using arrows in combat except to take down guard towers or blow up some explosive barrels. It felt as though the elemental effects of arrows were significantly weaker to the effects of melee weapons too, and maybe that's by design, which is fine. They are also crazy expensive, and thus I wanted to preserve them as much as I could, which I guess is a good thing. Which also leads me to a quick tangent before I talk more about the elements of combat, and that was prices. Everything is ludicrously expensive in this game. Now, I didn't do any side quests like at all, so maybe I could have gotten more money and made things easier, but I was selling precious gems like nobody's business just so I could afford some clothes. I almost never bought arrows unless I was desperate because they were also incredibly expensive, and sometimes I would just let archers shoot at me so I could pick up the arrows they shot because it was a cheaper way of gathering them. And I never bought ingredients for potions or food because they were equally as expensive, and as is, I didn't hardly use potions, but the price of the animals I would need for them was one of the reasons I didn't really bother with potions. They were simply too expensive, and trying to find them somewhere in the world was just not interesting to me. It simply wasn't worth 100 rupees to get temporary fire immunity or what have you. It's cheaper to eat food like Scooby-Doo to regenerate health than it is to make one potion. Now, to wrap up the negatives of combat, I think I'll wrap 2 points into one. There's not great bow or shield variety, and there's disappointing mob weapon drops. Real quick point with the bows and shields is that I felt like I was always rewarded with the same Hylian shield and knight's bow everywhere I went. Chest after chest had one of these two things in them, and it got pretty boring after a while. The only bow variety I ever found was when killing the Lynel or getting the bow from the bird people, but even then, there wasn't much to get excited about. My inventory was almost always a row of knight's bows, and the same can be said about shields. Not to mention shields were pretty boring overall. I don't know what exactly I'm looking for, but basically all you need to ask yourself is which one has the biggest number, and is it wooden or not, since wooden ones could be used in thunderstorms. None of the shields were special or did anything in particular. I only ever really cared about how they looked while walking around with them, which was kind of disappointing. But not nearly as disappointing as the weapons mobs would drop. Now, this isn't universal by any means. Some enemies drop great weapons, and I want to stress, some. The number of times I decided to avoid a group of mobs altogether because I didn't want to break my good weapons was a bit too high for my taste. The main problem with this being that some of the difficulty of the mobs and the strength of the weapon they dropped had zero correlation. You could kill a weak little bokoblin and get something great, and then kill a Lynel and walk away with something little better than a wooden stick. The only difference is one took 2 hits to kill, and the other broke 4 of your weapons before going down. I wish there was some sort of consistency with the quality of weapons you got from the stronger and weaker mobs, since then I'd be far more motivated to take on the stronger enemies. The first time I fought a Lynel, I did so figuring it would drop some awesome gear. It had to for how difficult he was to take down, right? Well, no. I broke 2 weapons that were far more powerful than the one I got after beating it, and it left me a bit vulnerable since those 2 good weapons were my only good ones. I let them break because I thought it would be worth it, and it wasn't. I ended up dying to some random lizard right after beating that Lynel and was set back to before I fought him, and I promptly mounted my horse and ignored him since I knew how bad the drops were. It wasn't until late in the game when I had plenty of weapons to spare that I decided to fight them again. Now let's wrap things up by talking about a few of the miscellaneous mechanics that I think could use some improvement. Now, I mentioned Koroks before and how not having too many slots actually forced me to use some of my good weapons. Now, it also meant I almost never had any of the utility weapons like torches, but I guess that's fine. I only have a small grief with the whole system because after running into the Korok guy like once, I forgot where he was and couldn't find him again, so I collected seeds for almost the entire game, but didn't find him again until after 3 of the beasts had already been defeated. I guess this is more my problem for forgetting where he was than it is the game's fault, but I wish he moved to each village or stable like Beetle does, so that way it would be easier for me to actually use the Korok seeds I had found. At the end of the game, he apparently moved to the Korok Forest, and maybe that's where you can constantly find him after giving him a certain number of seeds, but I never found the Korok Forest and it was already the end of the game. Maybe this next point should have been included in combat, but this is an issue that I have with all games that have auto-climbing features. And by that I mean, you run into a wall and your character just starts climbing it automatically once you've made contact with it. I get the idea for ease of use, but I can't remember the number of times it actually caused me to die in combat. If I was running away from an attack or even just trying to escape an enemy that was beyond my abilities, I would often try to run away only to bump into a wall behind me where Link would decide that his slow as molasses climbing is the perfect way to escape. I died so many times due to this mechanic, and it's frustrating as all get out. They could even have fixed this without removing the auto-climbing mechanic, since I also think it's kind of annoying having to click a button to climb. It's a bit of a lose-lose situation, this whole thing. But if there was a button that would automatically rotate the camera to where Link was looking, that would fix this problem to a large extent, I think. And they've done this before in Zelda games. In Twilight Princess, pressing the target button would immediately move the camera to where Link was looking, and it didn't have the problem of accidentally retargeting the enemy either. It was great and made fleeing much easier. There's also a minor issue with shrines, the main problem being inconsistency in their length. Sometimes it was just because I struggled with the puzzle more than other times, and that's fine. But in some shrines, even if you were flying through it, you could easily spend a solid 20 minutes getting through the whole thing, while others took maybe a minute at most. This isn't necessarily bad since it adds variety, but I must admit that there were times I avoided shrines because I didn't know if it would take 2 minutes or 20 minutes, and sometimes I just didn't have time to do a longer shrine. I guess I could have saved midway through, or at least I think you can do that. But stopping and starting a puzzle halfway through can be a little weird. It's not a big deal, but I thought I should mention it since the inconsistency did lead me to avoiding some of the game's content. There's also armor and shops. I know you come to Kakariko Village pretty early in the game if you follow the main quest line, but I actually had no idea there was a store there, and I didn't get my first armor set until I was gifted one by the Zoras in the Zora's Domain, and my first full set of armor didn't come until I stumbled upon a shop at the Rito Village. I honestly had no idea I should even be looking for shops that sell armor until I found this. Really, this is just user error. If I had just explored some of the villages more, then I could have found armor. Instead, I usually found a village and went right on by without doing much of anything in it. The game rewards you for actually taking your time to check out all the things, rather than just going from point A to point B like I usually do. This is more just something from my own point of view where I'm very objective focused, so I see the main quest and main mechanics and just do that and expect the game to give me everything along the way. But Breath of the Wild doesn't really do that. It trusts the player to figure things out. So I guess this is a good thing more than it is bad. I might just ask that the very first shop you should encounter in the game, that one being the one in Kakariko Village, I presume, had some sort of obvious sign like Mallow Mart in Twilight Princess to introduce the player to the fact that there are indeed shops in the game. Though with the main quest line, one of the first quests you're given is recovering your memories by finding all these locations on your Sheikah Slate. Going to be honest, never bothered with this. I only found one of them on purpose, and that's the one outside the big castle because that was pretty obvious. The others seemed really obscure without much in the way of landmarks when I first saw them, so I simply didn't bother or care. I think I ended up running into 3 or 4 memories, with all but one being accidental. Is there a way to make this search easier? The world is simply too big for me to scour it for 13 random locations, although looking back at them now, there are definitely a few I probably could have found on purpose if I had actually tried, but there's still several that I ain't got the foggiest clue where they could be. Now maybe finding all of these memories is necessary for this one last negative. That is that I never found the Master Sword. It was a bit sad really to never find this sword. I really wanted to get it, but after uncovering the whole map and taking down divine beasts, I hadn't the foggiest clue where I had been and where I hadn't been and where the sword could possibly be. Again, maybe finding some more memories would have led to this old lady telling me roughly where to go, but I just had to mention this because it was a bit of a letdown never finding the Master Sword over the natural course of gameplay. I wish it was more heavily tied to the divine beasts or what have you. But I guess that's the thing that makes or breaks a person's enjoyment of this game. In the end, it presents the player with a vast open world and trusts them to figure out what to do, and allows them to do whatever they want to do in whatever order they want. And whether you like the game or not will heavily depend on how you enjoy this fact. Personally, I'd give this game an 8 out of 10. And before you grab your torches and pitchforks saying that this is a 10 out of 10, full stop, here's how I rate things. 1 means utter garbage that should have never been made, 3 is so bad that it's painful, 5 is that it's just not very good, 7 means it's worth it, 8 means pretty good, 9 means fantastic, and 10 means it's one of the greatest games of all time. Of course, I'm rating this based off of my own personal experience and has nothing to do with the general public's opinion of the game. I know several people who rate this game as one of their favorites, and they may hate me for saying what I'm saying now. Though to be clear, I only rate one game as a 10 at the moment, and that game is Terraria. Check out my Terraria channel, by the way, if that interests you. Link in the description. And I'd probably only give the 10 rating to the top 3 games in my life. What the other 2 are, I don't know, but I'm afraid it's not Breath of the Wild. This game is really good, and I think it definitely deserves a 9 or a 10 for many of the people who play it. It mostly just comes down to how much you enjoy being given very little to work with in a vast open world, as well as how much time you actually have to play the game, since it's going to take a while no matter what you do the first time. Maybe I just like games with a little more direction to them, or maybe fixing some of the minor gripes that I have with it would have elevated it above an 8 for me. But those are my thoughts on the game, and I'm sticking to it. Maybe I'll revisit it sometime. But first, I should get to work on trying this Tears of the Kingdom thing. Maybe it's improved on some of these downsides I've mentioned. But if you've been putting off Breath of the Wild like I did, maybe you should give it a try. It's definitely worth the experience, especially since it's one of those few games that trust the player to figure things out on their own. It gives you the ability to do what you want, to make the decisions on your own, and it gives you a few pointers here and there if you are willing to actually search for them. It respects the player, and for that, I respect it.